Great, okay. So thanks for this presentation. I would add that over the past 10 years, I've been recording birds very actively. I've had about 15,000 recordings of bird sounds. So what I'm going to talk to you about is the benefits of this new sound recording techniques for us bird watchers. So I'll start with a few generalities about bioacoustics and how we can use it for bird watching, and then I will provide some very concrete examples so you can just see how it works. The pointer doesn't seem to work. Does it work now, or you will skip the slides? Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to let you know is that those sound recordings 90 years ago, there was a guy who was named Carl Weissman who played sounds of several birds, including marsh warblers, at the Danish state radio. So 90 years ago, this means that we already had all the techniques to record bird sounds and also to play bird sounds. Yet, and yet it's only now that we are starting to fully explore the potential of these new techniques. For example, with automated bat identification or databases that have most of the sounds of the birds of the world, or many things like nocturnal migration that has been really increasing over the recent years. So the question, next slide, yeah, is why did it take so long for us to use those sound recording techniques for bird watching? The first answer, there are three answers. The first answer is the size and cost of sound recording device. 50 years ago, some people already started to record nocturnal bird migration. And as you can see, they used things like that, which was not very practical nor convenient. Now, a few years later, next slide, yeah. Oh, it works? Okay, yeah. Sorry. I will take it again. So now we have very affordable materials that can be used for sound recording and much more accessible, as you see. This is what some people use to do nocturnal bird migration, for example. The second thing is about how you deal with the data. So it's not only about recording bird sounds, but it's also about being able to use those bird sounds and analyze them to identify the species. So 50 years ago, if you wanted to draw sonograms, what I'm going to talk about later, you had to use very sophisticated tools like this one, which were not very affordable nor practical. Now, with a computer and free softwares, you have all that you need to analyze your bird recordings. So this was a great improvement, of course, and this makes it much more accessible. And the third one, last but not least, I would say, is that it's only now that there's a structured and organized bird recordist network. 30 years ago, there were very few people recording bird sounds. Now, as you can see on one of the sound databases, Xenoconto, there has been an exponential increase in the number of people recording bird sounds, and not only in Europe and North America, but all over the 5 continents. So this was a major improvement, because if you have other people to talk to about bird recording, of course, it's easier to get more and more people involved in those bird recording techniques and sharing their sounds all over the world. And so that's how we could get to some new protocols, especially around about nocturnal migration of birds. I'm going to talk about it later too. So there's an interesting parallel to draw with cameras and bird photography, the visual approach. It's actually very recent techniques, and Kilian will talk about that this evening, probably better than me, so I'll be short about that. But the first affordable cameras were made about 30 years ago, digital cameras, of course. It's only about 20 years that us birders are really using those techniques, and it's only now that we are fully exploring the potential of those techniques, like camera traps, automated photography identifications, or very detailed analysis of molt or of feather details that were not that accessible without bird photography. So we are about the same stage for bird sounds. It's not exactly a new technology because it has been existing for a long time. It's not fully developed yet because there's still much to do, especially about automated identification and signal processing. So we are somewhere here at a very interesting point where the potential of sound recording has not been fully explored, but it's clearly increasing. You probably noticed that there are more and more birders recording sounds and more bird watchers using it to identify some birds. What I would add also is that sound technology are quite low-tech compared to visual technology, to camera technologies. Actually, some people even make their own microphones. A parabolic microphone is something that has not that much technology in it compared to a digital camera. So you can either build it or buy it to one of the producers. And that's why it has much potential for further exploration, because actually it's affordable and it could be used at a very wide scale in the future years. So now a few generalities about bioacoustics and how it works. The main thing that we noticed is that our hearing has limited abilities. So our ears are not that good as other senses. What I mean is not that. This is what most people think about, is the loss of the highest frequency with the age. You probably all know that. This is not that much important for birding because many birds have low sounds or not that much high-pitched sounds. So, of course, it has an effect on us, but this is not the main limitation of our hearing abilities. The main limitation is what is linked to our brain. It's the fact that when you get too much information at the same time in your ears, you just don't understand what happens. So when you hear a concerto, for example, you hear a general melody, but you are completely unable to tell which instrument plays which notes. And that's about the same thing with birds. You probably know the phenomenon that is called down chorus at spring. Sometimes early in the morning you have many, many birds singing at the same time. And then it's very difficult to isolate those different bird sounds and be able to identify all species. At the same time, when you have very quick songs, like wrens or many birds do very quick songs, you are completely unable to tell which notes it is doing, how much notes there are, how they are linked together. So that's the main limitation of our hearing abilities. It's the fact that we get too much information to be able to understand everything that happens. Yet, the good news is that we have other senses that are very well developed. And one of them, of course, is sight. It's your eyes. If you look at a map, there's a huge amount of information on a map. Just imagine how long it would take if I had to tell this map by speaking, if you had to listen to this map, if I would say, there is this road that goes between this town, it would take a huge amount of time. With your sight, you can very easily find the information you're looking for. And that's exactly what we are going to use in bioacoustics. We are going to convert sounds into images because it's way easier to study, to analyze a picture than to study a bird's sound. So here is an example. You have a recording of 1 minute, and during this 1 minute, there are two birds that are flying over my microphone. There's a purple heron and a night heron. So this is the sonogram, the conversion of the sound into an image. And here, on the x-axis, you have time. So 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And on the y-axis, you have frequency. So the higher a sound is, the higher it will be on the spectrogram. And the lower the sound is, the lower it will be on the spectrogram. So this is a visual representation of this sound. And the big advantage is that in 1 minute, it would take 1 minute to listen to this sound, but in just 1 second, you can see that they are birds, these little black marks. And if you zoom at all the signals, you can identify very easily those birds and say, yes, it's a purple heron and it's a night heron. So it's way quicker to look at the sound than to listen to the sound. So now let's look at an example with a song thrush. You probably all know that song thrush is a remarkable singer. It's why it has been called song thrush. But what you probably didn't know is that song thrush is also a remarkable drawer. And that's what I'm going to show you. With the sonograms, we can see we can see in a very accurate way all the different notes. So there's a video that should play but doesn't work, but doesn't matter. One thing that you can notice is that all notes are different, but the specificity of song thrush is that it repeats 2 or 3 times the same note. So if we look on a sonogram, it's not visible here because the video doesn't work, but you would say 3 times the same note every time, and then it switches to another note. So it's a very powerful way of studying bird sounds because you can see all those different notes, you can study them way more accurately than just listening to the song of the song thrush. Okay, so is it difficult to identify bird sounds with sonograms? That's the main question. Can everyone do that, or is it something that needs very high qualification? So to try that, we're going to play my favorite game that I've called the Chiff-Chaff Willow Warbler game. I show you one picture of a Chiff-Chaff and one picture of a Willow Warbler. So theoretically, you have all the information needed to identify a Chiff-Chaff and a Willow Warbler because I've shown you 2 pictures. But as you know, those 2 birds are very tricky to identify in the field. So if I show you a third bird, a third image, and I ask you, is it a Chiff-Chaff or a Willow Warbler, what would you answer? So people who think that it's a common Chiff-Chaff, please raise your hands. And people who think that it's a Willow Warbler, please raise your hand. Okay, so it's about 50-50, which proves that those birds are really difficult to identify. It's not new. And now we're going to do the same thing with calls. So the songs are very different. I don't even show you the songs because they are pretty different. So let's try with the calls, which is a little more subtle. I show you a sonogram of a common Chiff-Chaff, and on the right, a sonogram of a Willow Warbler. And here is our third bird, the same as before. And now people who think that it's a common Chiff-Chaff, please raise your hand. And people who think that it's a Willow Warbler, please raise your hand. Yeah. So you see, even if I didn't tell you how to identify a sonogram, I told you almost nothing about sonograms, just intuitively, you were able to identify this bird. So it shows that it's very basic. It's just comparing similar pictures, images, and those images are very easy, as you can see, because they are very simple. It's just a rising note or a 2-syllable motif. So it's something that it's way easier to interpret than a bird photography. And that's why it's very powerful. You can see that you identified a very tricky bird very intuitively. So now that I have introduced all those basic notions about bioacoustics and how to identify bird sounds, I'm going to illustrate it with a few examples that will be eloquent for bird watchers. The first one is one of the most popular examples. It's the ortolan benching. So the ortolan benching is a species that is present on the Mediterranean shores, but also in Northern Europe. There are populations in Scandinavia or Eastern Europe. And that is migrating through a major part of Europe, I would say, especially at the end of summer. The problem with this species is that it's very difficult to identify by ear because it only makes some little chips or clicks that can easily go unnoticed. And the other property of this bird is that it's migrating mostly at night, so that birders don't usually hear it in the field when it's migrating because they are sleeping. So here is an example in Paris area where I live, so the whole region of Paris that has many birders. And as you can see, based on visual approach, so people finding ortolan bentings when they are doing the field with their binoculars or with a scope, with visual approach, it's a very rare bird near Paris. There are only 1 or 2 records each year. Before 2010, there were very few records of these birds. And what happened is that for about 5 years, we've been recording at night with passive recorders. This is something that has increased over the recent years. It's called nocturnal bird migration. And it has considerably changed the way we approach this ortolan benting that was considered as a very rare migrant through Paris area. Because since we've been recording, you can see that the number of ortolan bentings has increased amazingly. There are way more ortolan bentings that have been recorded migrating at night that have been found visually in the field. So this has considerably changed the way we are detecting ortolan benting, because there was a detection bias because birders were sleeping at the time ortolan bentings were migrating, because they couldn't detect it because it was quite subtle. And one impressive figure that I wanted to give you is that 10 years of birding near Paris with all the birding community near Paris produced 22 ortolan bentings. And one friend of mine, Julien Rochefort, had a very special night in 2018, and he recorded 45 ortolan bentings in a single night. So this means that in one night, one guy recorded 2 times more ortolan bentings than the whole birding community in 10 years. So this was a considerable improvement in the detection of the species. And there have been studies on ortolan bentings that have showed with geolocators that those birds are flying low at night and flying over Paris, which confirmed what we could find with our acoustic approach. Another example, this time at day, because tawny pipit migrates also at day. It can also migrate at night, but it's a detail. This is also a species that when you don't live in its breeding range, you probably are not familiar with it. Some people didn't know its call. Actually, it has 2 types of calls. Those little calls that look like sparrow calls that can easily go unnoticed. And then this one that is a most powerful call and easier to detect. So people living in Northern Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Netherlands, were not very familiar with the sound of this species until recently, because they didn't know that it was a regular migrant through this area, or at least there weren't so many references about bird songs 10, 20 years ago. So there were very few records of these birds until 2010. It's only around 2010 that we started to record those birds on migration spots. And once again, a considerable improvement in the detection of this species over the past years with the use of parabolic dishes, which enable you to hear further, and with the use of passive recorders. So for those 2 species, the conservation status is quite poor in the northern part of the range. Those birds are decreasing, so it's not an increase of the population of the birds. We should be careful about data interpretation, but just the fact that we are detecting them way more easily. So this is about how we can use sound techniques for improving our detection of some birds. Now I will talk about species separation, how we can identify species with bird calls. There are many popular examples, like the chiefchaff willow warbler that I showed you before, but I wanted to introduce a more unexpected example. with a question that I asked myself a few years ago is, can I tell the difference between the call of a house sparrow and the call of a tree sparrow? So this is a particular example because they are actually pretty common birds, at least in some part of the range. And yet, there's not been much in the literature about how you tell those species by ear. I wasn't quite even sure that it was possible to tell those two species by ear. It's quite confused. Some people say that, yes, you can identify them. Some other people say that, well, there's a lot of variation, and it's not clear whether you can identify them or not. So let's have a look at that. When you want to do that, the first thing that you do is that you take recordings of house sparrows, you take recording of tree sparrows, and then you compare them. So this is house sparrow calls, and this is tree sparrow calls. So as you can see, it's a mess, because there's a huge variability in these calls, and what it seems to look like is, well, it's probably a huge overlap between house sparrow and tree sparrows. What we can hear looks quite similar, or at least it's very varied, so it's difficult to analyze this. Yet, when you do that, you probably have not put the question the good way, because there are actually several types of calls. If you look at the birds and associate a behavior with the call, you will see that there are some flight calls, so calls made by the bird when they are flying, that are very stable, that almost never change. And then there are other types of calls, which we can call social calls when the bird interact, or songs when the bird is chirping in a tree, what you hear the most often. And these are different types of calls, so we shouldn't compare them inside the same species. So what we're going to do is that we are going to take the flight calls that are very stable and now listen only to flight calls of house sparrow and then flight calls of tree sparrows. So house sparrow and no tree sparrow. And then you can see that all these calls look similar between in the same species, but pretty different actually between house sparrow and tree sparrows. So if you go further into the analysis and take bird types of calls, then you can answer your question, and you can see that house sparrow and tree sparrows have different flight calls, and actually it's not that difficult to identify them by ear. You can also see this on sonogram, where the tree sparrow call looks much shorter. So now let's take it to a next level. I've chosen this example because it is considered by many authors as one of the biggest identification challenge in the West Palearctic. It's juvenile little stint that is migrating through Europe, and juvenile red-necked stint that is migrating through Eastern Asia. These birds are extremely difficult to tell by their appearance. You have to look at very tiny details, and it's very, very difficult to identify them visually. So let's have a look at them with an acoustic approach and see if we can do something. So first, let's hear at some juvenile little stint calls. You see that it's a very sharp and pure call, very special for a shorebird actually. And then calls from juvenile red-necked stint. So I don't know if it's quite clear, but one of them is very pure, and the other one looks more like an outburst. Actually, there's quite a big difference between the call of these two species. And even if you have a big flock of juvenile little stints with one single red-necked stint, you can still hear it. Let's have a try. So little stints, and then here the red-necked stint, the more rolled note. So it's quite surprising to see that actually on an acoustic basis, it works quite well to separate those two species. We're not thinking about it. But you can find a very useful criteria with acoustic approach to tell those two species apart. And it's not often mentioned in the literature. There are many articles that deal with the separation of those two species and don't even deal with the acoustic approach. And just to show you that it works very well on the field, This is another example, so a semi-palmated sandpiper, this time the American species that is equivalent to the two I've showed you before. And this is a bird that I found 2 years ago in France on the Île of Saint, and it was calling. So I immediately knew that it wasn't a little stint. So this is the absolute proof that it works, because yes, indeed, you can pick a semi-palmated sandpiper, which is a very tricky identification, by its sound. When you hear that, it's different from what we've heard on the little stint before. So there could be surprising applications for bird watchers in identifying some tricky species based on visual approach. So this was for specific identification. Now let's go even further. Let's try to identify not species, not even subspecies, but population. This has been very well studied by Ralph Martin and Julien Rochefort on crossbills. Actually, there's not one population of crossbill in Europe, but there are about 20 populations of crossbills, and they all have their own regional accent. So a crossbill from Britain does not sound the same as a crossbill from Italy, from Germany, or from Spain. This is very interesting because not only the calls differ, all types of calls, flight calls, social calls, but also the songs. And these are very stable. Actually, there are even some authors that are asking whether this couldn't be species because we can identify them based on their call. But it's not, there's nothing different on visual criteria. So let's have a listen at those crossbill calls. So first, Welsh crossbill. Then let's take a British crossbill. You see that by ear, you can tell that there's a difference. No one from the Alps. And finally, one from Italy. So for a trained ear, this could be perceptible by ear, but there's an easier way to identify them is to look at the sonograms. And once again, they are very easy shapes and very different ones. The Welsh crossbill is like a W, this one is descending, this one is like a V, and this one is like an inverted V. So you can see that by sonograms, you can pretty easily identify not even species, not even subspecies, but just population of crossbills, which is pretty interesting. And my friend Julien Rochefort, that has been studying this, is so good at that, he's so trained, that when we go on the field together and there's a flock of crossbill coming over us, he says, oh, there are 5 Welsh, 3 Germans, and 2 Italians. At first, I didn't believe him, but every time I checked the sonograms, he was right. So this was really getting me nervous. So the acoustic approach is also opening new fields of investigation. And one of them is the field of birding at night. It wouldn't even come to your mind with a visual approach because you don't see anything, or you need lights and it's complicated. But if you focus on sound, you can actually do birding at night. And that's pretty interesting because things are happening at night. There are many birds that are migrating at night. They just get up at the end of the day and migrate at night. So this has been a field where a lot of people got involved over the past few years, and that is quickly increasing. There are some people here that I recognize that do many NOCMIG, and there's a workshop this evening about this. So this is a very interesting field of investigation with plenty of things to discover. It's quite new. It's also very useful to detect cryptical species, some species that are singing at night, owls, rails, crakes. And this is, of course, a new way, a new experience for birding because it's not at all the same thing birding during the day or birding at night. It's a truly new sensorial experience that it's worth trying just for it. So now I will share I will have a more contemplative approach to this bird recording techniques. And I just wanted to share some recordings that I particularly enjoy and appreciate and that relate to good birding moments. And so I wanted to share them with you just to show you that it's interesting to record birds not only to identify them, to overcome some detection bias, but it could also be enjoyable just to record bird sounds for fun, for artistic purpose. So this is a recording from Iceland of a bird that you don't usually hear when it's coming here in the winter. It's the red-throated diver. I was used to have distant views on the lake in winter plumage. And then I came to Iceland and I noticed that this is a remarkable singer. It has a very, very loud song. And so here on this recording, we are in Iceland. We are in a very quiet place. Tundra, Icelandic tundra is very quiet. There's no other birds, no cars, no planes, no insects at all. And at the end of the night, at the end of the day, so the beginning of the night, a flock of red-throated divers is slowly starting to sing, and it's rising in intensity. So let's hear that. It's quite a nice recording. So first, some individuals are starting to call. They are calling each other. This is what you can hear, the very raspy soul. And then they are starting to sing, and you'll see that it's increasing. So when you're at night in Iceland and you hear that, it's very spectacular also. Worth recording just for the memory. And now everything sings together. They are very loud sounds, so you can hear that even when you're a mile away. Okay, second example is a very particular recording because it was taken at night. And actually, there are so many birds singing on this recording that you might believe that it was taken at day, but it was taken under moonlight in France, in a very special place where the last corncrakes breed. And in these places, there are several species that are used to sing during the nights and that have quite different songs. Corncrake has a primitive song. Winchat has a more complex song. So let's have a listen at that and just imagine that this is during the night. So you can hear corncrake, winchat, you can also hear warbler. Grasshopper warbler. Several species singing at the same time at night, which is quite remarkable. The third recording I wanted to share with you, there are 4 recordings, is doesn't seem to work. Can you, yeah. It was taken in Iceland again, and it's interesting because it's a bird that we don't use to approach with an acoustic approach. So puffin is typically the thing that you see on pictures, that is very nice bird that you can get quite close to when you are in Iceland or Scotland, for example. But most people don't hear puffin singing because it has a very weird song that it makes only at night. And here I wanted to illustrate the fact that you can record directly bird sounds, but you can also just leave a microphone somewhere and pick it in the next morning and then listen to what happens. That's exactly what I did there. I put a microphone on a puffin colony in Iceland, and I went to pick it only in the next day. So this is pretty interesting because there's no disturbance at all. You arrive here in the day, the birds are not there, and in the night they are flying to their nest, and they make sounds, and you pick it up once again the next day, and you have all this atmosphere without even being there, with no disturbance at all. So this is the weird call of puffin, very strange, like a motorbike coming at the nest. And you also see that they are getting so close to the microphone that we can even hear the wing beats at the beginning. This is the song of puffin. So it would be very difficult to record this sound at day with a traditional microphone, but leaving a microphone at night enables to have very good results, as you can see. Okay. So it's a very it conveys a very different image of puffin than what we are used to with our visual approach. Not exactly the same thing to look at this bird and to record it. And the final example is of a very cryptical species, Bayon's crake. Actually, we know very little about this bird because it's so difficult to see it. It's so difficult to find it on breeding grounds that we weren't even sure that it was present in France, that it was nesting in France. So we started to record at night. And the first thing that happened is that people recording nocturnal migration started to record them flying over their house, which was quite surprising for such a rare species. So this was the first signal, and then we went to explore some wetlands near the places where people recorded that over their house to see if we couldn't find some singing Bayon's crake. And that was a pretty good surprise because there was a night here when we took part of an exploration of an area of France that is difficultly accessible. And we found 12 singing males of Bayon crake, which was a huge surprise because we weren't even sure that the species were breeding in France. So 12 at the same time was never heard before. And you can see that this bird is very interesting because it usually starts singing around midnight when everyone is sleeping in very difficult places, wetlands that are difficultly accessible. So it's difficult to prove that the species is present. But with an acoustic approach, we finally find them, and we can identify them too, because as you will see, it has a very special song that reminds a lot of a frog. So finding something that looks like a frog in the middle of frogs is not the easiest thing you can imagine. But this night was pretty particular for me, and this is a recording of Bayon's crake, just 2 or 3 meters of us. We were on a boat. And you'll see that it's pretty special. Yeah. No. Just the previous one. It seems to work, so maybe I should just do it myself. So Bayon's crake song. So at first, it could be easily mistaken with a frog, but if you look at the subtle details, especially in sonograms, you see that it's not the same way to produce this sound. It's a bird that is making this sound, not a frog that compresses air. So sound approach is very interesting for that because we can find cryptical species that are pretty difficult to find just based on a visual approach, like this one that is hiding in marshes. Okay, so as a conclusion, I wanted to come back on something that has been very striking for me over the past few years. It's the difference we used to have between sound and visual approach in the birding community, the bird watching community. Many people say, when you don't see the bird, it doesn't really count. You probably already have heard that. And I like to answer ironically to that with a few examples like crossbills, marsh teeth, or warblers that are very difficult to identify based on visual criteria. So my answer is always, but when you don't hear the bird, actually it doesn't really count, no? So this is just to show you that there's a weird contrast between the visual approach and the sound approach in our birdwatching communities. And actually, if you think of some species like the Eurasian bittern, the great bittern, seeing a bittern is something, but hearing its impressive booming, loud booming in the night is a whole new experience. So you don't really have the whole experience of bittern if you just have a look at them. Having a look at them is one experience. Listening to them is an experience. There are two complementary approaches that we really would need to practice both. And yeah, as a conclusion, many of us have learned bird watching through a scope, the use of a scope, counting shorebirds or counting ducks with a scope, so a pretty much visual approach. And this is very perceptible because there are very few people still using microphones, even if there are more of them. You don't see much parabolic dishes, you don't see much microphones, but it would really deserve to be more practiced. And you can see that we have field guides that have very accurate description of all kinds of plumages, male, female, how to age them. But for a common species, just like the common blackbird, in the most popular field guides, which are really impressive amount of work on plumage details, you read that the blackbird makes puk 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 or ching 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 or chuk chuk chuk, and this is extremely frustrating, yeah, because you read that, and what can you do with that? It's very difficult to interpret this in the field. So this sound approach definitely needs to be more explored. We definitely need to have more sound recording, more accurate description of sound recordings, and more powerful tools for analyzing the sound recordings. So thanks for listening to me. Thanks for inviting me here. And I hope that this will make you want to start bird recording and explore this whole new universe that is sound recording.